Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Some people feel in our world that science and religion are in conflict on this issue of evolution, that there's no reconciling the two. And they feel that we live in a culture that sort of blindly accepts this whole evolutionary approach, and that isn't right, and that we ought to be teaching our youngsters this alternate view, creationism, which means that God made the world in the beginning, rather full-blown, and did it in a 6-day period. Or some of them would not take it all literally and say that those periods were geological ages in some way, but they clearly would be opposed to this whole idea of evolution.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. Today's reflections focuses on the topic of creationism and evolutionary theory. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, I'm glad that I have the chance to talk to you on this program because you have been taking a course of mine recently called The Thought of Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit paleontologist and religious visionary, and I would like to give you an exam on that material. And so I thought that maybe this program would be a good opportunity to do that. Are you ready for that?
Well, I do have a crib sheet. Should I put it away?
No, I think that you better use it.
Yes, sir.
In trying to deal with this. The test has to do with the question of evolution and creationism. Okay? That's the topic, and which is really a live topic these days because of the whole school debate issue. So we have some people in our culture who think that creationism ought to be taught in the schools as an alternative to evolutionary theory. We know there's been religious groups who have felt for a long time that really this whole business of evolution is a crazy kind of that followers have foisted on us, and that it really is the root cause of a lot of our problems in the world. This whole idea that we have descended from lower forms of life and from the animal kingdom seems to upset these people very much. And one of the reasons that it upsets them is because evolutionary theory seems to go against clear biblical teaching. So that we have in the early chapters of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we have the creation account, and we have the idea that the world was created in 6 days, and that the Lord God Yahweh rested on the 7th day. We have a picture of the world that says there was a state of perfection that existed in the beginning, and that people through sin fell from that higher state of perfection. And many of those who read the Bible in a literal or fundamentalist way feel that evolutionary theory goes against the clear teachings of the Bible. And for these people, the real norm for all truth is not science, but the biblical teaching. The Bible is an inerrant book, and therefore if science somehow contradicts it, it is because science has made a mistake, because the scientific method has not been followed accurately. As a matter of fact, it's important to remember that the biblical fundamentalists are of the mind that religious truth and scientific truth and common sense will really never contradict one another. They're very open to the use of the scientific method, but they use as their final criterion for judging whether the science is correct or not that teaching that is found in the Bible. So the topic, I guess, that we're getting into, and we'll forget the exam for a while, is really this question of creationism versus evolutionary theory. Now, are you ready to respond to that or not? If you can put away your crib sheet and just try to deal with the topic at hand. So I'm trying to set the problem, okay? I'm trying to point out the way that some people feel in our world that science and religion are in conflict on this issue of evolution, that there's no reconciling the two. And they feel that we live in a culture that sort of blindly accepts this whole evolutionary approach, and that isn't right, and that we ought to be teaching our youngsters this alternate view, creationism, which means that God made the world in the beginning, rather full-blown, and did it in a 6-day period. Or some of them would not take it all literally and say that those periods were geological ages in some way, but they clearly would be opposed to this whole idea of evolution. And I'm suggesting that sort of represents the kind of problem that many people might have, even people who aren't biblical fundamentalists. Now, in the Catholic community, we know that this has been a problem. Teilhard de Chardin became, for many people, a figure that was hated or disliked or felt that he was leading us astray precisely because he espoused all of these evolutionary notions. That people, Catholics who were not really biblical fundamentalists at all, still felt that evolutionary theory would call into question the solid and stable and timeless truths that we live by in our Catholic community. And I think that in one way they're right, because his kind of thinking really has shaken up much of our perception of what the world is all about, and sort of faced many of us with a need to reinterpret our Christian understanding of things. So after I sort of expand on the problem there, do you want to comment on that in some way?
Well, I mentioned on an earlier show that science, like any other activity, does have a tendency to get dogmatized and to fall into traditions. And I think as we look at religions, the same thing. There seems to be a need to know what the absolute truth is, that religion is supposed to give us the absolute truth. And at least in the Christian tradition, the final biblical stories of the creation are something that are handed down from generation to generation and thought to convey some sort of truth about where we came from. I think science stands on uncontestable grounds. They're on very good ground. I'm not sure Charles Darwin, who set out on the voyage of the Beagle, decided to upturn the biblical account of Genesis. I think it's just the evidence that is at hand as he traveled around the world as a helper to the ship's naturalists. He started to see a pattern emerge. The facts there in the earth themselves showed that evolution, or some process, was occurring. And we also know that over the centuries we've expanded our concept of time from, it used to be thought that the world was created 4,000 years before man, say in the 17th century, was living. Suddenly we now have to deal with billions of years. Maybe the universe began 15 billion years ago. All these seem to be facts that come down. Now, the problem with people is, how can we reinterpret our religious truths? I think most of us need to have this sense for a need of security. They want to know that what is said, and what is true. I mentioned earlier that a good scientist doesn't always lean on the old facts as they were popularly understood if he finds something new that seems more sound and fundamentally better. And maybe that's the attitude that most of us should strike with religion. I'm not specifically talking about behavioral, situational ethics. I guess I'm talking more about fundamental truths, that we should be willing to open our minds up to a new viewpoint as long as somehow it fundamentally rings true. And I think with all religious truths, regardless of the new cloak they would wear, if instead of wearing the cloak of the Genesis account, suddenly creation wears the cloak of evolution, still somehow there should be a fundamental truth linking the two. I think the problem that arises out of fundamentalism, at least on this issue, may at bottom be a problem of insecurity, saying I need to have something I can grasp and concrete and believe in.
Tom, we go back again to your comments about Darwin and the scientific community. I think we can take it as a fact that clear majority opinion in the world of science, if not a unanimous one, is in favor of evolutionary theory. Right? All of the facts seem to point to that. And I think we could take it as just an assumption that the scientific world works on today. Would that not be true?
Oh, I think evolution is rarely contested in solid scientific fields.
I heard Ashley Montague talking about this question on public radio one time and said that he had gotten into a debate with the biblical fundamentalists on this and had come off very badly, or perhaps it was one of his friends who had gotten in the debate and really couldn't handle it because their premises were so different. They couldn't really match worldviews in any way. They were talking different languages entirely, and he claimed that he was really sort of afraid to debate biblical fundamentalists in this way because he really didn't know how to handle it. But within his scientific framework, the whole evolutionary theory, of course, made sense. And I think that perhaps that helps to highlight the kind of problem that we have here as well, that we have whole different languages going on, whole different worldviews that are at stake. So the scientist likes to use the empirical method and begins to think that the fossil remains and everything else we know about our world really suggests this long evolutionary process. I think the point you made about duration is really important, along with that of space. It seems like this expansion of our sense of time and space has really influenced us in many ways. I mean, before Galileo, when we thought that our Earth was the center of everything, it seemed to give human beings a more secure feeling. And when we thought that the world was only a few thousand years old, it seemed like it was all more manageable somehow. And I have the feeling that this expansion of our sense of time and space really begins to influence us in terms of that point of security that you brought out. I think of the time, the figure I often see quoted as something like 4.6 billion years old that our universe might be. Well, whatever.
The edge of the Earth.
Yeah. Whatever those figures actually are. The average person says that's a mighty long time. That's more than I can really end up comprehending. I think I like those little analogies that are often used about if you would take the whole history of our world since man appeared on the earth and compress it into 1 year. Jesus Christ would come very late in that year. In fact, my remembrance is it's something like around noon on December 31st of that year. Our recorded history would be a tiny part of that long history that human beings have existed on this earth. When you begin to look at it that way, so you compress the whole history of mankind on the earth into 1 year, and Christ appears very late in the last day of that year, recorded history very late. It begins to give us some sense of that tremendous duration, and I think that perhaps somehow seeps into our consciousness, and when we begin to learn things like that, we can begin to feel very insignificant. I think of the same thing about space. I remember seeing just a little bit of Cosmos, Carl Sagan's program, and where he picked up the sands from the shore and said something like this: well, there's more worlds out there than there are grains of sand on all the oceans on our earth, and all the beaches of the oceans on our earth. Well, I mean, that notion just, I thought I didn't hear it right, and I later asked a scientific friend of mine whether I had heard it right, and he said yes. So there is this immensity of space and this expanding universe of ours, again, that could create, it seems to me, some of this sense of insecurity that you are talking about. So the modern scientific world, it's not, has produced a crisis, I think, not just because Darwin said we came from apes, descended from them, but because it's given us a universe that is so vast and of such long duration that we begin to feel insignificant in some way. That maybe this highlights our sense of insecurity as we go about our business on this earth.
you would almost wonder if you took the fundamentalist perspective, why they wouldn't want to embrace a vision as large and grand as the one science presents of the universe, rather than one something as narrow as 4,000-year-old history that somehow spans from the Saudi Arabia around the globe. You're talking a mere 25,000 miles. That's a pittance in the universe. And you would wonder why confine this vision of God to this mere act that we call the earth. And another issue would be, how could Moses, presumed author of the book, communicate what science communicates to us today? He had no language for it anyways. And the science has given us a new language in the sense of the world. It would fall on deaf ears.
I think that the creationists are saying is, and what really stands behind it as they articulate it, is that they must preserve the inerrancy of the Bible. They must show that everything in the Bible, absolutely everything, is free from error. And it's when science begins mucking around in that, as they would say, into that area, they are very nervous because their worldview is at stake. Their whole outlook on what the universe is all about and who they are and how they fit into it all is based on saying the ultimate truth is in this book that we know as the Bible. And it does say in there that we have this creation account. It does have this notion of the world being created by God in fixed and static fashion in the 6-day period. And it does have numbers in there that can be added up to tell us the number of generations since Adam lived on this earth. So when they begin to read the Bible in that literal and inerrant way, that becomes their criterion for truth. And I think that is what they must defend. And again, I think that stands behind one part, at least, of this debate between creationism and evolutionism.
Maybe science, as far as promulgating evolution, could show them a format of dealing with this issue of inerrancy. Because if you look at evolution isn't a foolproof method of progress. There are lots of mistakes in evolution. As Carl Sagan said, the secrets of evolution are death and time. So you see many lines of animals disappearing, reptiles going here and there, but there's a general trend towards progress. There's a general trend that takes us from stardust to the imagination that we are using now. Maybe they should look at the text of the Bible not as some verbatim expression from a God on high, but as sort of a dynamic book that exudes a truth that not always is expressed literally, but can come out and can suffer the buffeting it's going to get as it has to deal with man's increasing knowledge gained elsewhere.
As you and I know from doing our course on Teilhard de Chardin together, that one of his main problems in life was to try to effect this reconciliation that we're talking about. From his scientific studies as a paleontologist and a geologist, he became convinced of the truth of evolution. But he began to see it not just in terms of descent from lower forms of life, but as really an ascent, a moving forward of the evolutionary spiral. For him, the whole of the world was moving irreversibly towards a greater spiritualization and moving finally towards a final communion of love, which he ended up calling Omega Point. So for him, when he looked at the evolutionary data, when he examined it from a scientific viewpoint, he began to think that he saw a pattern, and that indeed the world was evolving towards this greater spiritualization, doing it in an irreversible way, groping, as he liked to say the image was, it was groping its way forward, as you suggested, making mistakes as it went along, but moving towards a gradually greater perfection. For him, the great energy in the world was really the energy of love. He once said that if you wanted to write the real history of the world, you would write the history of love struggling against alienation and separation. so that love becomes the uniting force, the energy in the world that brings it closer together, gradually unifies it till it ends up being totally unified in what he called the omega point, in which he later identified with Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, the universal Christ that Paul the Apostle talked about. I mean, especially in the later writings, Colossians and Ephesians, we find those magnificent passages that say that Jesus Christ is the center of the whole universe, that everything holds together in him. Well, Teilhard picked up those passages and said, aha, what my evolutionary outlook tells me is the very same thing that I get from rereading my Bible. So when I reread my Bible, instead of focusing just on the Genesis account, he will read Romans 8, which talks about the whole world groaning until it shares in the victory of the sons of God. And he'll talk about the first chapters of Colossians and Ephesians, which give him this picture of the universal Christ, the cosmic Lord, who is in rule over the whole of creation, who draws it all to himself, who's gradually filling up his own body towards an ultimate fullness where everything will reach its final reward and goal. It really is a grand vision that he gives us, and for him it was a great breakthrough. What it enabled him to do is to say, hey, I can be a scientist. I can hold evolution totally and completely. I can see evolution as a light within which all facts are to be interpreted. He could hold it with passion and at the same time remain a Christian person. Because what did he do? He reinterpreted his Christianity. He focused in on certain parts of the Bible that have often been forgotten. So he was able to say that, no, I get a different picture of Christ here. I get a picture of a Christ who is drawing the whole world to himself, who's pushing the evolutionary spiral forward, who calls upon us to cooperate with him in spreading the kingdom and making sure that this progress of love is enhanced and increased. So he represents here kind of person who would suggest one way, at least, of dealing with this problem of evolution versus creationism. So I think you gave us one important idea from the scientific viewpoint, as I understood you anyway, and that is to say that science would suggest a groping process, a harmonious, a larger picture, and that maybe if we read our Bible with that in mind, we would see things that we didn't see before. And now we have Teilhard's attempt to somehow reconcile science and religion here, and to put together evolutionary theory with the way he reads his Bible, mostly by reinterpreting it.
Well, if you look at the inerrancy issue, maybe from a fundamentalist viewpoint, the preservation of their piety is by adhering absolutely to the belief in inerrancy. And if somehow there could be a figure, someone like Teilhard, who could show you that one can assume all of the knowledge that science has brought to them over the years and still somehow maintain a piety about it all, maybe there'll be a reconciliation there. Because I think that's a fundamental issue here, that I am being a bad Christian if I do not believe my Bible is a verbatim, word-for-word, literal account of the truth. And I don't think Darwin, for example, would provide that model for anybody. He really is Beelzebub's right-hand man from a fundamentalist viewpoint. He didn't even believe in the progressiveness of evolution. His idea was that it was just a random statistical process going on that really has no directing force other than natural selection dealing with local causes.
That would be a place where Teilhard would really provide a Christian interpretation of evolution, that it is a directed kind of process, that God is behind it as the source of all of the energy, the love energy in the world, and is really at the conclusion of the process, the summit towards which it moves. And I think that's where he would give us an evolution that has purpose and direction in it, which I think would be much more in line with our general Christian understanding of the world.
And also just with a common sense feeling that is all this for nothing. Most of us do not embrace the philosophy of absurdity with any contentment. And I think I think Teilhard presents probably the best model I can think of at present to provide a reconciliation between a creationist and an evolutionist, let's say, who's agnostic.
Let's, I think we could argue this from still a third point, not argue it, but try to effect this reconciliation from the world of biblical scholarship. Because what the Bible scholars tell us is that the Bible is really a book that teaches religion and not science or history. That the biblical authors didn't have in mind to teach us how the world began. They had in mind to teach us that God is responsible for the world, that He's the Creator, and that we have to respond positively to Him as the Creator. And when we don't, sin enters the world, and with sin, all kind of pain and suffering and human difficulties. This is really a religious message which is timeless or has an enduring value to it. It is a message about how the divine-human interaction works and the kind of God that we believe in, a loving Father who has created this whole world of ours. But the author simply assumed this static worldview, simply used other kind of material to get his lesson across. But his major purpose was not to teach a cosmology or a worldview or to tell us exactly how the world began. Nor was his major message to teach us how long ago this happened or what the total lifespan of our earth is. His message was a religious one, not a scientific one or an historical one. Now, I think that little bit of insight often helps the average person to deal with this question. I mean, it's not a hard idea to get, really. So when you read the six-day account and teach it to children, what we're trying to get across is the notion that God is the Creator and we are the creatures and we are dependent upon Him. And that when we fail to follow out that relationship in a proper way, sin and death enter the world. So I think that would help. And I suppose that the other thing out of the world of biblical scholarship is that whole idea of literary forms, of being able to read the Bible accounts according to the conventions that the author used, the types of literary styles that he adopted. And here we have clearly in Genesis, I think, a very poetic style, a of legend and myth in order to teach important lessons. So I believe, again, the world of biblical scholarship would help us with this problem. Tom, it's interesting the kind of passion that comes around this issue, isn't it? I mean, we have a really striking debate between the creationists and those who espouse evolutionary theory. The two worlds don't seem to meet. And I think it's because the worldview is fundamentally different. The presuppositions are different. And I think it's really important for us to find ways to talk to one another about it and to begin to effect some sort of reconciliation on this important issue in our society. From my own liberal theological viewpoint, it seems like Teilhard, as you suggested, represents a possible type of synthesis where the whole notion of evolution can be placed into a theological framework and where we're moving towards a final goal where God really is all in all.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont.